Welcome to the next lecture that we're doing in our Ability 360 Adapt to Home series with Move United. Today we're talking all about hydration importance and strategies for athletes. My name is Christopher Perry. I am a strength and conditioning consultant for Ability 360, and we are talking all about great things that we can do for you all at home during these crazy times. Doing a whole bunch of numerous different topics. If you guys are interested, please check out our YouTube page where we house all of these after we finish recording them. Today's topic is all about hydration, particularly where we are at Ability 360 in Phoenix, Arizona. Hydration is a hot topic and of utmost importance, but don't let that deter you. It doesn't matter what environment you're in, whether you're in hot conditions or cold, hydration is super important. So we're going to highlight a lot today on the science behind the functions of water and why staying hydrated is so important for various functions of the human body itself. And then we'll get into how to actually strategize how to keep yourselves, if you're weekend warriors, or if you have children who are in athletics as well, and how to keep them hydrated throughout the entire day. So for those of you who are brand new to our Move United series, my name is Christopher Perry. I'm a strength and conditioning coach and professor at Bryan University. I am also finishing up my doctorate at Arizona State, and I've been in the fitness industry for many years, coming up on my 13th anniversary, and I work with the wheelchair basketball team at Ability 360. So today, we're going to talk all about hydration. And why is hydration so critical? Well, first off, I want to highlight one of the most important nutrients that we consume on a daily basis, and is usually one of the most underrated nutrients as well. What am I talking about? You guessed it, water. All right. I can probably pick a handful of people out of a crowd and guarantee that they're dehydrated. So many people, it doesn't matter your age, is most likely dehydrated at a certain time. And the biggest takeaway is that people just don't know they're dehydrated. They don't know what signs to look for, or to even know how much water or how much fluids they need to drink per day. One of the other assumptions about staying hydrated as well is that a lot of individuals don't have the education behind what electrolytes are and why electrolytes are so important when it comes to proper hydration of an athlete or someone who's really physically active. So it's very, very important that we understand the basics, how much water we need and how much we should be getting throughout the day in order to stay properly hydrated. And not being hydrated affects so many different aspects of the body. But before we get there, let's go over water itself, all right? So water is H2O, all right? That's two hydrogen molecules attached to one oxygen, all right? And it is over 60% of your total body weight, all right? We are almost made completely of water, all right? Your brain is nearly over 80% water. Our blood is almost over 95% water. If you're not getting enough water per day, it negatively impacts how all of our physiological systems work under the hood and can affect our performance. It can make us feel sluggish, make us feel sick, okay? And the biggest takeaway as well is water is not stored, okay? Water in must equal water out. And it's very important that we understand this concept and why it's so important that we're constantly drinking water throughout the day. So if I were to look at the percentages of what organs in your body are completely made up of water, of what percentage, your eyes, 95% water, your heart, 75, muscle, over 75%, your lungs, kidneys, brain, virtually everything that has such a vital importance in your body is completely made up of water. And just being at 1% level of dehydration, which is usually a cumulative about 1% of your loss of your body weight, is enough to cause dehydration issues. Usually first thing in the morning is when a lot of people first wake up and are dehydrated right off the bat. And sometimes people, the first thing they reach for is a coffee rather than actually getting actual fluids in. And sometimes a lot of people complain of things like brain fog or simply not being able to think clear or being groggy and overly fatigued in the morning. Most oftentimes people think that this is either due to not getting enough sleep, which most often it is, but it's also a combination of simply being dehydrated. When you are not getting enough fluids, particularly first thing in the morning, anywhere from 12 to 20 ounces or so, your brain actually functions 10% lower than its full capacity as if you were, unless you were hydrated. So it's very, very, very important that the first thing you do when you wake up is drink a tall glass of water. So one of the first indicators that I want to talk about on how to know if you're dehydrated or not is thirst. But a common misconception is people think, oh, I'm thirsty. Okay, now I need to drink. If you're waiting until you're thirsty to consume fluids, it's already too late. You've already hit that threshold mark and you are already dehydrated. The goal here is to be pre-hydrated already before this happens. And the only way that you're going to be able to do that is if you're consistently consuming fluids throughout the day. It is of utmost importance to try and beat dehydration before it even becomes an issue. So how does thirst work in the first place? So if we were to go through the process in the human body of how our brain sends a signal to us to thirst, the first thing arises is the sensors in your blood. So when you become dehydrated, the overall volume of your blood goes down, okay? Your blood is a liquid. And within your blood, we have the liquid that's composed of water, and we have what's called solutes, okay? So there's various solutes in your blood, various electrolytes. The most important one I'm going to talk about is salt, okay? And when you are dehydrated and don't have enough fluids in your body, the solute concentration goes up, okay? So that's if you start to, it's as if you look at water, for instance, and you start to see more salt appear within the liquid. Same thing happens to your blood. When the blood volume itself starts to go down, but there's more solute concentration, it triggers an alarm in your cardiovascular system to the brain that says, hey, we're starting to lose blood volume. We need a signal to the body right away to start taking in fluids. So as a reaction, your body's saliva secretion will go down, and you'll start to get the symptoms of dry mouth, and you'll start to feel really, really dry. And you'll start to feel that thirst, okay? Together, the dry mouth with the decrease in blood volume will send a signal to the brain that will cause you to start to drink water or start to seek it out more often. There is also other things that come with this, and we're going to talk about here in just a second, that have to do with a particular hormone that is released from the brain to prevent you from further dehydration later on. But as we know, if you don't continue to drink water right away, it will get worse and worse and worse as time goes on. And our main organ that's in charge of this whole regulation process are our kidneys, okay? So your kidneys are those pair of organs that sit behind here, behind our hips, up top here, and our backside, okay? And they function as a filter, okay? They filter your blood through everything, all right? They take everything that's not what we need in our body and excreted it out in the urine, okay? So all unneeded substances, those are removed by our kidneys, okay? You have two very important filters in the body, the kidneys and the liver, okay? And your kidneys functions are the ones that are going to actually gather the substances that we don't need and excrete them out throughout the body. Another function that a lot of people are not aware of, though, is that it also is in charge of reabsorbing fluids back into the blood in order to prevent severe dehydration from taking place. And the way that this happens is by a very special hormone called antidiuretic hormone, otherwise known as ADH. And so when we start to get that thirst mechanism, excuse me, our kidneys will send a message to the brain that'll release ADH from our pituitary gland. And as a result, it'll cause our kidneys to start reabsorbing as much liquid as it possibly can, okay? One way you can tell if this is happening in your body is if even if you started drinking some fluids and still feel that urge to go, it's more difficult to go to the restroom. You'll find that your frequency of visiting the restroom is not as frequent as it normally is or should be, okay? So when you start to feel thirsty, it's very apparent that ADH was also released from the blood as well, all right? And it stimulates the kidneys to reabsorb your as much fluid as it possibly can to keep your blood from becoming way too concentrated. So I want to go over the functions of water and why it's so important in the first place. And I'm going to walk through one by one, and then I'm going to pose a question as to what it might look familiar to. Now, usually that's going to be more of a question for my students at the university, but I'm going to try and put two and two together for you all who are watching this presentation on these similarities in the types of functions and what type of physiological system they're so related to. So, for instance, the main function of water, first of all, is a medium for a participant in all metabolic reactions. You need water to transport absolutely everything in your body. You need it for blood, right? And your blood is your primary carrier of all nutrients, of all wastes. It transports all hormones responsible for proper endocrine function. It transports enzymes that are required to start and ignite a lot of physiological processes in your body. If you didn't have those enzymes to do that, a lot of reactions would not take place. If you didn't have your cardiovascular system to transport those things around, it'd be very, very difficult for life to happen. It also regulates your acid-base balance, okay? And it regulates your blood to whether it gets too acidic or too basic and tries to keep it right in the middle in a process called homeostasis. Your body likes to stay right in the middle. Having enough water in your body allows this to take place. It also provides protection and regulates body temperature. So drinking enough water is going to ensure that we have proper thermoregulatory function, which is going to be especially important for staying hydrated when we're exercising, especially outside in those warmer environments. Now, when I teach class at the university, I always pose a question to my students who are going to be future fitness professionals or healthcare professionals, and I ask them, what similar body system does this sound very virtually alike? Okay, and this will give you a clue as to why it's so important that we stay hydrated, because if we don't stay hydrated, it negatively impacts this one very important system in the body, and that system is your cardiovascular system. If you are not hydrated, your heart has to work overtime, more than it ever had to possible. All right, your blood pressure goes up, your heart rate goes up. There's more stress placed on the cardiovascular system. It is so very important to stay hydrated for the purpose of keeping your cardiovascular system at optimal functioning, because not only is this going to decrease proper blood flow to the brain and proper oxygen saturation of tissues in your body, it's going to reduce your cardiac output, which is going to reduce your overall VO2 max, which we've talked about in a previous presentation, which has a lot to do with the consumption of oxygen and our performance when it comes to athletics. And it makes our body work so hard, we're going to fatigue so much faster. We're going to get to the point where we'll be severely exhausted, and it could also potentially cause harm. If you become way too dehydrated for too long, it can even cause severe organ failure. So it's of utmost importance to stay as hydrated as humanly possible for the overall health of your cardiovascular system. Let's talk a little bit about its thermoregulatory function. So a lot of people don't understand how sweating actually keeps you cool, okay? It works in a number of ways, all right? So when I'm fully hydrated enough and the bloodstream is going around my body, what happens is it absorbs the heat from the core, from my core body temperature, and distributes it around the body. As a result, it's going to radiate that heat out, and that heat is going to be released through the sweat glands in liquid. Okay, so it's going to release solutes. You're going to lose some electrolytes, salt, calcium, a little bit of potassium. Okay, and what happens is that water in the form of sweat is going to evaporate on the surface of your skin, which allows the heat to be lost. As a result of that, that liquid is going to evaporate, all right, which will actually cool the skin. And with the blood continuing to travel around your body, it is the temperature of the blood at that time is a little cooler than what it was in the first place, and has a cooling effect on your core body temperature. So this is why sweating is such a vital process, such a vital thing for your body to do in order to stay cooler. Now, let's really briefly talk about water and health and disease, okay? Just to bring it to your attention, because a lot of people will say, well, how long can you go without drinking water? And how long can you go without food? Because a lot of people say, well, I can go without food for a long time. Is that the same thing for water? No, you can actually go for a long time without food, okay? Your body is very intelligent in its metabolic processes and being able to break down your own tissue for energy. That's not good, okay? You don't want to do that. But your body can survive if it needs to. Whereas if you don't drink enough water, you might not live past 2 or 3 days, all right? It is so vitally important to have enough water for vital functioning. So much more important than food. Water is the primary nutrient you need to be consuming throughout the entire day, and it should be of utmost priority, okay? So now let's get into the sweet stuff. Let's talk about dehydration. If we were to define dehydration, we could define it as a state that occurs when you don't have enough water present in the body, all right? It causes that reduction in blood volume like we talked about, which we see an increase of solute concentration, so we have more salts, okay, compared to having volume of actual blood, and it impairs our overall ability to deliver oxygen and nutrients to the cells. As a result, it also affects our ability to remove waste products that start to build up in our bloodstream. So it's so very important that we try to keep dehydration at bay at all costs possible. So how do you feel when you're dehydrated? Well, lots of certain things. So the first off, as I was talking about just a little earlier, you'll start to feel some cognitive deficits. So you'll start to feel some brain foggish type issues. You might be thinking to say something, but you actually might find yourself tripping over your words. Very common symptom when you're dehydrated. You'll also find that you have a lack of energy. You'll be fatiguing very early during your exercise, particularly in hotter weather. You will feel hotter within yourself, all right, because you'll have poor regulatory function. Your body won't be able to regulate your body temperature as well. You might feel clammy or have flushed skin. You'll find that your trips to the bathroom are now less frequent. You're not going as much anymore. You have a headache. This is one of the most common symptoms that a lot of people complain about oftentimes. And sometimes dehydration can even result in migraines. So it's very, very important to stay hydrated for the overall purpose of preventing a headache from occurring. You might also feel disoriented, right? You might feel that you are not able to keep your balance. You might find that you're having shortness of breath. And you'll also have poor performance, mental and physical. If you're not hydrated, particularly with the amount of electrolytes that you need, you might actually find that you're not able to lift weights as strong as you were before. You might not be able to feel a contraction as well. You might not be able to get the sarcoplasmic response in muscle tissue as you thought before. This is what we just call the pump, right, when you do strength training. And you might find that you gas out really, really fast when doing cardiovascular training. And where you found that you might have been at a really high level of endurance before, if you're dehydrated, you might find that you can't go nearly as hard as you could during endurance activity as you could before. So it's very, very important to pay attention to these signs and symptoms, especially when we're coaches or fitness professionals or healthcare professionals and we're working with young athletes or children. Very, very important to pay attention to a lot of these different signs. What is one of the most potent, powerful, or valuable ways I can tell that I'm dehydrated? Look at your urine. Okay? When you go to the restroom and you're urinating into the toilet, the color of your urine is a key indicator of how well hydrated you are. And the gold standard for being at utmost hydration is just a tint of yellow in your urine. Okay? That means there's a decent amount of solutes coming out, but also a great amount of fluid that's being excreted as well, which is a good signature that there's as much water that's going in as coming out, and you have a good level of hydration. As you start to become more and more hydrated, the color of your urine is going to become darker and darker, okay? Which is going to be a clear indication to you that you need to consume fluids as soon as humanly possible. Relying on thirst is not enough. You must be proactive in your staying hydrated approach to offset dehydration, especially if you're someone who's physically active throughout the day or live in drier environments. But just because you live in an environment that has a higher level of humidity, like Florida, okay, doesn't mean that you don't have to stay hydrated because you still lose fluids just as well. Okay, which brings me to my next point. Okay, it doesn't matter the environment that you're in, whether you're under the sun, in the heat, wearing shoulder pads, or whether you're wearing layers upon layers of sweatshirts and compression gear while you're running in winter conditions, or if you're indoors on the basketball court or playing some form of indoor sport. No matter where you are, no matter what environment, you are at risk for dehydration. Especially, and it's common concern and a common misconception that just because it's cold outside that you don't sweat. Common misconception. You lose just as much fluids in the cold doing exercise as you do if you're exercising in normal temperatures or in hot temperatures. So it's very, very important to understand. Doesn't matter what type of physical activity you're doing or what environment you're in, even if you're not physically active, you're going to need to stay hydrated at all costs. So what are the overall effects of dehydration? First thing, decreased blood volume, okay? So we talked about this already 2 times, okay? That decreased blood volume goes down, higher solute concentration, okay? The next one, decreased performance, okay? You're not gonna be able to exercise nearly as hard. You're not gonna be able to think or perform mentally as well, okay? You're even gonna find a decrease in your blood pressure, which can also be dangerous. You will find that your sweat rate also decreases because your body is going to work at all costs to keep as many fluids as it can in your body. You'll also see decreased blood flow to the skin. You'll start to feel flushed and clammy. You'll find that you have decreased cardiac output, which is your overall performance of the heart. So your resting heart rate might have to work a little harder to continue to push your blood around the cardiovascular system. And you'll have that increased heart rate, okay? So what do we do? Well, first of all, let's take a look at how fast that we lose fluids, okay? Because you can actually, there's been classic studies that have been done by Rehrer and Burke back in 1996, where they compared the sweating rates of a variety of different sports. And as you see from top to bottom, the top sport, although they were in the water, they still lost sweat at a decent rate. And as we go down the list, we increase the rate of which we're losing fluids. So as you can see from all sports, you're losing fluids at a pretty significant rate. But especially the more anaerobic style sports, such as rugby, soccer is very anaerobic depending upon your position. But so we could usually say the more active you are, the higher intensity of activity, the overall more fluid loss you're going to incur. Okay, so very, very important to pay attention to the type of sports as well. Regardless, if you're physically active, you need to be aware of hydration. So this graph here shows how performance decrements occur over time, okay, and how much body weight loss we actually look at, and why we've seen that VO2 max decreases with fluid loss. Okay, and as we see over time throughout our workouts, as I start to lose 1% body weight, which is equal to 1% fluids as well, okay, my exercise capacity starts to decrease. This is why it's so important not only to pre-hydrate before exercise, but to maintain hydration during activity as well. And there's a very important way to do that, because not only are we losing water when we exercise, we're also losing very, very valuable electrolytes that are very, very important for a proper functioning of cells within our body when it comes to fluids. Heat also is going to accelerate this process even more, okay? And we have to pay a lot of attention, especially to our young athletes who are in the sun all the time and living in hotter states, such as Arizona, especially in the Phoenix area. Because especially younger athletes, which we're going to talk about here in a second, are at much higher risk for things like heat exhaustion and heat stroke. And in order to prevent those things from happening, coaches, fitness, and healthcare professionals need to be highly aware of the current hydration status of their athletes, and that they're getting frequent restitution and recovering of those fluids as exercise is occurring throughout the day. So heat illness is very dangerous, okay? And heat illness can set in quite rapidly when you're in a heated environment, particularly if there was not a lot of time spent educating or working with your athletes beforehand to get hydrated before the activity. And this can eventually lead to heat exhaustion, which if not caught right away can lead to heat stroke, okay? And younger athletes are at much higher risk of this than adults, mainly because their cardiovascular systems simply are not yet developed to the point that adults are. Adults' thermoregulatory function is very, very well developed compared to an adolescent, okay? And an adolescent will experience heat exhaustion much faster compared to an adult. So how much do I need? Well, first of all, because I know my water needs and I know that I'm already feeling thirsty, this is the perfect time during the presentation to take a little water break myself. Once again, being proactive as often as you can to stay hydrated to maintain performance. So when it comes to meeting my water needs, when it comes to the adequate intake, so AI stands for adequate intake by the Dietetics Association. And what the ADA has found for us is that men need at least 3.7 liters per day. Okay, that's anywhere from 8 to 12 glasses of water, whereas women need 2.7 liters per day. Now, that's just baseline. That has nothing to do with your overall activity or your overall diet or any type of your behavior patterns. So for the following things that I'm going to list here might increase your overall needs of water. So for instance, if you're more physically active and you're someone who's going to be losing fluids at a much more rapid rate and more often than someone who's sedentary, you're going to need more fluids. If it's an increased temperature environment, you're going to need more. If it's decreased humidity, if you're consuming a lot of protein, protein is one of the main macronutrients that requires more water and more metabolic processes to fully digest and assimilate into the body. If you're on a low-calorie diet under calorie restriction, if you're working with someone that has weight loss goals, even more so, you need more fluids. If you have a high salt diet, if you get in a lot more solutes into the body, and this occurs especially in our society today, especially in American culture, where many of our individuals who are overweight or obese consume a high degree amount of processed foods, which are really, really, really high in sodium, okay? And often Americans get way too much salt when it comes to our diet, especially if individuals are consuming those processed foods. If you have caffeine intake, okay, now the research goes back and forth on caffeine. Overall, a little bit of something like coffee, it actually isn't that bad for you. And caffeine itself does not cause dehydration. But if you consume too much caffeine, that can act as a diuretic. Alcohol intake, for sure, is a major diuretic. And if you consume alcohol, you will become dehydrated. Okay, now for our kids, that shouldn't be an issue. They shouldn't be consuming it. But for adults, need to be responsible with making sure that they're staying hydrated if they choose to consume at a moderate level of alcoholic beverages. Is there such a thing as becoming overhydrated? And this is something that's not usually taught to any athlete. Yes, it's a condition called hyponatremia. Hypo means low, so otherwise that means sodium in this case is low in the blood. Na is the chemical formula for salt, and emia means in the blood. Okay, so there's low salt in the blood. And this happens especially when people overconsume water without electrolytes. Okay, and what happens is water transports from place to place via a process called osmosis when it moves from the blood into the tissues. And when someone consumes way too much water, okay, especially without those electrolytes, the water is going to move into the tissues and it's going to dilute that higher concentration of solutes, and it's going to cause what we call tissue swelling or edema. And this can actually occur in the brain as well. There have been many instances, especially in ultra endurance events, especially things like marathons, where a lot of athletes back in the day simply were not educated on this, and they thought that they had to continue to drink more and more and more water to stay hydrated throughout exercise. But at the same time, they were losing so many electrolytes through their sweat that they weren't replacing those electrolytes, and as a result having too much fluids and causing that edema which would eventually cause failure of the brain and causes death. Okay, it's been seen multiple times throughout some major endurance events throughout our history, and it's something that coaches need to be very aware of, which is why partly one of the reasons why sport drinks were invented. So just to get into a little bit more about what hyponatremia means, okay, it's caused by when athletes in particular rehydrate with water, okay, especially during longer events. So it's not going to be a major issue during a 1 to 2 hour event or a 1 to 2 hour practice or games or so on and so forth, okay? You're going to have a less likely chance of that occurring, okay? But if you are athletes that are into a high degree of cardiovascular activity or high endurance activities, then this can be a potential problem and something that you need to educate your athletes on. It may even lead to weight gain during the event because you're not able to excrete those fluids because of your lack of solutes. So the overall recommendation is work to minimize the risk of dehydration and hyponatremia by having balanced fluids with electrolytes that are consumed and making sure that you're matching fluid loss over time throughout the activity. Consuming a lot of salty foods and beverages during activities like marathons and triathlons and so on and so forth is a great way to help abstain from hyponatremia sitting in. So let's talk about what these electrolytes are all about. I've been throwing that name out over and over and over again, and many of you might have heard of them on the media. But what electrolytes really are, it's not just sodium and potassium. So when you see sodium and potassium, these are negative or positive ions that conduct an electrical current, okay? And if they do not work correctly, it becomes very difficult for an action potential to shoot down the neuron and be able to cause some sort of reaction to take place, whether it's a body process or whether it's muscle contraction and so on and so forth, right? So it's very, very important that we have the ability to make sure that we're getting in enough electrolytes, especially for proper heart function as well. Okay, so as you can see, the main functions of electrolytes is to ensure that we have fluid balance, that we have proper nerve impulse conduction, and proper cellular signaling that allow events to take place under the hood of your body to make sure everything is hunky-dory. So what are the recommendations? So if you've ever paid attention to nutrition labels on food, you will often find that the salt content is always much higher than potassium, okay? And yet, we need a lot of potassium in order to keep a balance with sodium. So when you see the letters UL, whenever you're seeing any type of dietetics recommendations, that means the upper limit. And when it comes to salt, the upper limit is about 2,300 milligrams per day or 2.3 grams. Now, when it comes to the American diet, okay, and consuming nonstop processed foods, fast foods, flavored beverages, okay, the typical consumption ends up being 3 grams or more, which is a lot. And for individuals who are either genetically predisposed to high blood pressure, okay, usually Hispanics and African Americans are at much higher risk of prehypertension than Caucasian counterparts. But being overweight, being sedentary, or simply your genetics overall, okay, can predispose you to having hypertension. And if you're consuming too much salt, it will exacerbate the issue and make it worse. And you'll be more likely to have high blood pressure and be more likely to put on some sort of altering diet intervention or some form of high blood pressure medication. When it comes to potassium, we don't nearly get enough, all right? The daily recommended intake is 4.7 grams per day or 4,700 milligrams. I can guarantee you that there's a handful of people that would sit right in front of me. I'd say none of them gets nearly that much because it's very, very difficult. You have to eat many servings of healthy fruits and vegetables on the daily in order to get enough potassium. It's very, very important that we do so for proper functioning in the human body. If you don't have a balance of sodium and potassium, it will affect the impact of your cardiovascular system functioning and your overall athletic performance. So it's very, very, very important to pay attention if you're prioritizing getting the electrolytes you need than simply just drinking water. And when we have electrolyte deficiency, the following things can occur. Your appetite might suffer. You will be more likely to have muscle cramps during competition or just rudimentary exercise. You might feel a little bit more confused or be a little bit more not cognitively aware. You might actually receive constipation, okay? And there'll be disturbances in your overall fluid balance. So what do we do, coach? All right, if you were to ask me, what do we do? How do we teach our athletes? Or how do we teach individuals to stay as hydrated as possible? Okay, well, lo and behold, there's a lot of different things we can do, okay? And the first one is to prioritize education, okay? Teaching, especially our adolescent children, why it's important to drink fluids, because one of the biggest issues that dietitians will run into many times, and parents themselves, is that their kids just don't like to drink water, okay? Mom, it doesn't taste good, okay? When it's of utmost importance that we teach them that it is very, very important to drink fluids as often as possible while avoiding consuming fluids that have too many calories, because in our day and age within American culture, it is very important to make sure that we pay attention to those things. Miss Myra, do you have a question? No? Okay. All right. So moving forward. So first thing, let me go over the overview or rationale when it comes to overall fluid replacement, okay? So when fluids is lost during exercise, all right, we will lose, we start to have decrements of performance at a 2% loss of fluids. And that can occur within 30 minutes to an hour. It can happen really, really quick. You can lose as much as 2.8 liters of water during an hour of activity. That becomes multiplied by 1.5 to 2 times if we're in the heat. So we have to make sure we're really, really careful, because exercise is, our fluid loss is also going to depend upon our exercise intensity and the environmental conditions. So we really need to focus on replenishing sodium, potassium, chloride, and magnesium, which we can find in a lot of different common sports drinks, because that's needed for the normal functioning of muscle tissue, for enzymes that are responsible for breaking down things like carbohydrates for energy during exercise, and proper hormones as well that are needed for recovery. So we need to make sure that we have a plan set in place for before exercise, during exercise, and after exercise when it comes to replacing fluids. So first thing, let's tackle before exercise, all right? Your overall goal is that you should be hydrated hours before you even get to practice, or before you get to the gym, or before you go to your event, all right? It is of utmost importance that hydration starts first thing in the morning, all right? There should be no ands, ifs, or buts. When you are educating either adults or younger kids, athletes, adolescents, whoever the population that is that you're working with, you need to educate them that you need to start from the moment you wake up in the morning and continue all the way through until you encounter your physical activity event, your workout for the day, or your practice for sports or overall event itself, all right? Very, very important. So what you want to do is slowly drink beverages for at least 4 hours prior to. Okay, you don't want to chug fluids by any means, but you want to keep fluid intake regular. okay? Especially if the urine color is dark, okay? So it's very, very important to make sure that you're paying attention to the key markers of urine color and overall thirst, right? And making sure as well that whatever you're drinking has a little bit of salt or electrolytes, right? So they've actually compared and contrast different fluids of whether it was just straight water or fluids with electrolytes in them. And they have found that you rehydrate much quicker with fluids that have some sort of solutes in them. This is why they actually did a research test to figure out what was the best type of fluid to consume to stay hydrated. They compared normal water to sport drinks, to things like coconut water, to even things like milk and Coca-Cola. And you can probably guess the fluids that had more of a composition to them, that had more solutes in them, like sodium, potassium, magnesium, and chloride, or even carbohydrate and protein, those fluids are much more potent and powerful at hydrating an individual because they allow you to retain the fluid much more effectively. Now, I'm not saying before workout that you should have your athletes chug chocolate milk or Coca-Cola, because that would cause some sort of gastric distress, okay? And we wouldn't want that to occur. That would negatively impact performance. So we need to pick beverages that are going to be well tolerated and allow us to have our performance at an optimal level before exercise. So this is why I would always recommend things like sports drinks, but also being aware that you shouldn't have sport drinks with 0 calories, especially if you're an athlete, because having the sport drink with 0 calories, although it has electrolytes, it will adequately replenish electrolytes for that individual, and it will help hydrate them. But having the little bit of carbohydrate in the sugar helps it even more still. It has been found to help rehydrate even more efficiently than fluids with just the electrolytes in them, especially for an athlete who is working in either an aerobic or anaerobic style sport, where they're going to be utilizing carbohydrate for energy because they're working at higher intensities of activity. It's going to help replenish a little bit of muscle glycogen during that time and allow them to use the glucose to continue to facilitate activity. So definitely recommend sport drinks that have a little bit of carbohydrate, a little bit of sugar that'll be utilized during activity. So during exercise, our main goal is to maintain hydration without excessive dehydration. And we need to pay attention to the environment, because if you're working with athletes in an environment, and the best example is coaches that work with young football players, especially in the heat during the summer and preseason where they're doing 2-a-days. It is of utmost importance in a sport to this nature that coaches constantly keep tabs on their athletes to make sure that they're consuming enough fluids on the regular, at least once a half an hour, all right, at least. And making sure that they're consuming fluids that have ample solute concentration to them. Okay, because fluid replacement during exercise is associated with having a lower heart rate, lower body temperature, and lower RPE, which is rate of perceived exertion, which means that athletes that are really focused and have good coaches who really focus on having them replace their fluids over time are going to be able to perform better. They're not going to get as fatigued nearly as fast, and their heart isn't going to have to work as hard during that time. Okay, so it's very important for both prolonged or intermittent exercise. It doesn't matter what sport you are, or if you're working out in the gym, it needs to be something that is paid attention to during the entire workout bout or during the entire time of exercise. Let's talk about specifics for kids, okay? Because we need to make sure that we tackle the most difficult population oftentimes to get them to drink and make sure that they're drinking the right amounts and the most proper things. And so when you're working with kids, in order to avoid dehydration, you want to make sure little kids are drinking at least 5 ounces of cold water or some sort of flavored beverage every 20 minutes or so. And if they're adolescents, making sure that they're drinking at least 9 ounces of water or flavored beverage every 20 minutes. So remember, once again, we want them to consume fluids more often because of their underdeveloped cardiovascular system compared to an adult. So they're, once again, going to be at much higher risk for dehydration and much quicker than someone who's an adult. So make sure that we really pay attention to our little leaguers and our young adolescents who are constantly engaged in physical activity. Now, what about the beverage? So I've already mentioned a few slides ago about the composition of the fluids making a difference in how it can hydrate us. there's other things that we can pay attention to as well, including the temperature, okay? And the majority of research has gone a little bit back and forth, but for the majority of what we found in most evidence-based physiological research in the university level is that cooler temperature beverages tend to be not only more desired, but also much better at digesting quicker and rehydrating an individual much quicker. Okay, so cool to warm temperature fluids are the absolute best for rehydrating an individual. Making sure they contain electrolytes, sodium, potassium, magnesium, and chloride. Okay, and making sure that they have a little bit of carbohydrate, because having a little sugar in there is also going to help with that overall fluid retention. For every gram of carbohydrate you consume, you store 3 grams of water with it. So allowing you to stay more hydrated when you consume carbohydrates allows that process to be even more powerful in you rehydrating. Okay? After exercise, when it comes to fluid replacement. Now, when the exercise is over, this is when we have a primary time to replace fluids and jumpstart recovery. So this is a perfect time to consume beverages that might actually have a little bit more macronutrient composition to them, including carbohydrates and protein. So for every pound of body weight lost, you want to make sure that you're consuming at least 1.5 liters of fluid to restore those fluids. And I apologize, a kilogram of body weight lost. So remember, kilogram, the conversion rate is 2.2 pounds per 1 kilogram. So for every kilogram of weight loss that you've incurred during that physical activity bout, during your practice, during your workout, during your game, your event, you make sure that you're consuming at least 1.5 liters of fluid to replace what you've lost. Make sure it contains electrolytes and some sort of carbohydrates, because we also know from a future presentation that we're going to have all on carbohydrates is when you consume carbohydrates after exercise, it jumpstarts our recovery process, and it allows us to, after the workout, you're at a heightened level to be able to actually absorb carbohydrates to be stored as muscle glycogen. Muscle glycogen is another word for stored sugar in muscle tissue, and when you have a greater degree of muscle glycogen, that gives you more readily available energy for your muscles to use during exercise, games, and so on and so forth. So if you consume carbs right after your workouts or your games, this is a prime time to get those in and not only restore that muscle glycogen, but jumpstart recovery, especially when you consume protein with it. To this day, one of the best recovery drinks of all time has been always denoted as chocolate milk. Okay? Chocolate milk has forever been one of the most popular choices for many athletes, many professional athletes, collegiate athletes, because it's overall not only high in high quality protein, but it has a high fluid content and it has electrolytes. So chocolate milk is one of the best go-tos after exercise. In addition, sport drinks are also going to be very effective at this time as well. We need to talk a little bit about salt intake, because this is something that's very, very important, not only when it comes to hydration, but for our society as well. So when it comes to athletes, individuals who are much more physically active than their sedentary counterparts, they actually need more salt than the average individual. And you might find sometimes, especially with athletes who are really, really active, they actually might need to focus on consuming foods with a degree of salt in them. Now, that doesn't mean that they need to add salt to physically everything that they consume, because more than likely they'll get enough sodium from the food that they're consuming throughout their meals throughout the day. We need to focus more on the individuals who are over consuming these processed foods and are not as physically active, because we'll also run into that as well, where we'll have sedentary individuals who start out being more physically active and as a result think that they can start to consume more salty foods. That is not a message we want to send. We want to make sure that we send the proper message of getting an adequate amount of salt through more naturally non-processed foods in their meals without adding any extra. So the best way to test for this is the body weight is the best test of salt water replacement. If you have a constant body weight throughout the week, so if you take your body weight at the same time of day, every single day, compare the number of pounds. And if you are staying constant and consistent from day to day with maybe a plus or minus 2 pounds, then more than likely your salt intake is okay. Okay, you're getting an adequate amount. If your body weight fluctuates on the regular, then that might be a good indication that you have an irregular amount of salt intake throughout your diet, and it's something that you need to be brought to your attention, especially if you're at risk for high blood pressure. So oftentimes I get questions from parents, well, how do I get my kids to drink more fluids? Okay. And I'm going to give both my answers from being a coach and from being a teacher and from looking into research. And the best strategies that we can do for our kids is make it taste good. Okay. If they're not wired to be able to likes to drink water all the time, one of the most ingenious ways that a lot of dietitians recommend is to add fruit slices to water. It's one of the most delicious things you can do, and might even add a natural level of electrolytes to the water itself. So doing things like adding sliced up strawberries, sliced up oranges, and then with that you get a little bit of vitamin C into the fluids as well, and other vital micronutrients that might be really, really healthy for you. Things like kiwi, which have more potassium than bananas, could be something you could really do. Cucumbers is a really effective way to really sweeten up the flavor of water. I really love cucumber water. It's one of my favorites. Especially little kids, getting creative with the colors of bottles. All right, kids are attracted to fun. So when you are working with adolescents and children, making it as fun as possible is going to allow you to try to send a message to your kids or to your adolescents to drink more fluids. And the best thing you can do is be a role model. Kids like to follow an example. And if the parent is setting a proper example or the coach is setting a proper example, this is going to go a long way into demonstrating the importance of getting ample fluids into the body. So Myra, I'll take your question in just 1 second here at the end. So let's end here with the take-home messages and my overall concluding thoughts. Hydration is one of the most important key factors, not only to physical activity performance for an athlete, but for overall quality of health of life as well. All right. Fluid replacement is absolutely imperative for making sure your cardiovascular system is functioning effectively and that your heart doesn't have to overwork to keep the same amount of output to keep your quality of life throughout the day. Cold drinks tend to be a little bit more absorbed faster than warm drinks, okay? And remember, we need to take a preemptive approach to hydration. We need to make sure that we're being cognitively aware that we're focusing on hydration from the minute we wake up in the morning, and that we're paying attention to the fluids that we're taking in on a consistent basis throughout the day. We need to really take note of the fact that due to environmental conditions or the intensity of exercise or our dietary intake and the types of foods that we eat can really have an impact on how much fluids we need and how much fluids we lose throughout the day. So something we really need to pay attention to and prioritize even more on why it's important to have consistent intake of fluids throughout the day. And just to remember, when we're consuming beverages, to make sure, especially for the purpose of rehydration, to make sure that they have some sort of composition to them of proper amounts of electrolytes, and sometimes based off of the time of day or whether it's before or after exercise, having some carbohydrate in that as well to help retain the fluid retention. Now is the time for questions for anyone who have them. Miss Myra, what is your question? I can't hear you, Myra. You're muted. There you go.
We can add slices too with the water, or like bananas or two. We can add bananas too.
You could do that. The one problem with bananas is there's not really an easy way to say this. They're not as, I guess, liquidy based because they tend to be more mushy than other forms, but you could get away with putting banana slices in there if you could figure out a way to do that without the bananas deteriorating in, and then it makes a shake. So you would have to experiment with bananas to see if that would be a good choice.
How about kiwis?
Kiwi would be fine, sure. Any fruit that you would like, or vegetable that you could put in water to freshen up the taste or make it more applicable for children, to attractive for children to drink, would be a good choice.
So when is the next meeting?
What's that?
When is the next meeting?
Every Thursday, Myra.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome, Myra. For those of you tuning in and watching this on YouTube or watching the recording, thank you for coming and visiting us at Ability 360 at our Move United series and our hashtag Adapt to Home. Remember, we're doing all that we can to help educate you all on topics that you can really take hold, not only to improve your health, but to give you better performance tips for how you're keeping physically active during these crazy times. Please tune in every Thursday. We'll have a new topic at 5 p.m. Pacific time. We look forward to having you. Thank you for chiming in. And as always, stay healthy, stay safe, and thanks for coming.